I would also like to express my gratitude, firstly, to have had the chance to be that close to the Barragán Archive, to the legacy, to the eminent legacy of this eminent architect of the 20th century for such a long time. I had different roles. Recently, this role turned into a curator of the Barragán Archive. Before, or for a long time, I was just a research collaborator together with the director of the Barragán Foundation, Federica Zanco. For many years, I have been examining the archive, the Barragán Archive, and we're about to release a publication about our research. So I'm speaking today with the perspective of someone who has spent a lot of time with the Barragán Archive, and sometimes one notices that one is a bit blind for the context, for whatever is around. Still, I tried to prepare a lecture for you that on one hand sort of repeats the canonized Barragán, because Barragán has been canonized in a manner that is really hard to avoid. And on the other hand, I'm trying to give you a bit of a different narrative, or possibly something new or a bit more specific. And I also would like to express my gratitude to the students of HED and CENTRO Mexico City, and Bas Princen, who initiated the workshop that they had last year. The students from Geneva in July 2022, they came here for a visit, and then they left for Mexico and had the joint workshop with the students from Centro. And I'm very glad that finally we can show the results that they produced there in a sort of an ad hoc presentation for the end of their workshop, that we could reproduce this here at the Barragán Gallery. It gives a relevant, meaningful, and important counterweight to the more historically oriented presentation that we have at the Barragán Gallery. So as we have photographs in the exhibition, I thought that my talk should also be about photographs, photography, the relation between Barragán's architecture, Barragán himself, and photography and photographers. Take my glasses. Here we see Luis Barragán sitting in his library in 1963. This means at age 61. A cultivated, distinguished man. He has books around, artworks. The table is full of magazines, pens. At this moment in time, he has achieved quite a lot. He is already well known. A number of his masterpieces are built, yet there is more to come. In front of him is this stairs leading from the level where he's sitting to the mezzanine. This is taken much earlier, in 1951. It is one of the iconic pictures that we know of Barragán. And it was taken by the photographer Armando Salas, Portugal. Armando Salas, Portugal was the photographer who somehow made Barragán iconic. I'm going to show you a few of his photographs. They are well known, and still it's always a pleasure to see them again. Prieto López House in Jardines del Pedregal in Mexico City, built 1948 to 1951. It is a house built in a lava landscape, and the lava rocks, they are an important feature of the gardens of the houses built in this area. The Capuchin Convent Chapel in Tlalpan in Mexico City, built from 1954 to 1963, is another masterpiece by Luis Barragán. And we have to imagine, I'm showing you these pictures also, at 1961, these pictures were already they spread into the world of architecture and the people who are interested in architecture. Barragán was not yet a very famous architect, but he could rely on these images and on the fact that these images were already shown in magazines, in books. So this was, for the ones who knew him at the time, this was the picture they had of his work. This is a stained glass window by artist Matthias Göritz, an artist with whom Barragán for some time collaborated. This is the cross in the refectory. Then we have the towers, the Satellite Towers, landmark monument in the middle of a highway leaving Mexico City to the north, also in collaboration with artist Matthias Göritz in 1957. And then a subdivision and some interventions in this subdivision in the public space in Las Arboledas in Greater Mexico City, 1957 to 1962. Namely, the Bebedero fountain. It was an area where were intended for people who had horses, people who loved horse riding, and this was a water throw for the horses to drink. And another fountain in the same area. And the Barragán house, Barragán's own residence at Calle Francisco Ramirez 14 in Mexico City, built in 1948, but subsequently altered in several steps, once in the early 50s and then again in the 1960s. And that's the reason why it comes at the end for the moment in this list, because only in the early 60s it had the shape, the expression that we commonly know from the pictures conveyed through Armando Salas, Portugal. This is an earlier stage of the roof terrace that you have seen before. And I'm showing you this, on one hand, because it's beautiful. On the other hand, because this forms the background of a self-portrait of Armando Salas, Portugal. It is one of the few, if not the only, pictures that we have of Armando Salas, Portugal. Of course, there are some more around in the world. But we are close to Armando Salas, Portugal through his own vision, his view on Barragán's works. But actually, we don't have much in the other direction where we see him. So I wanted to present him also as a person, and I think it's quite telling. The concentration, one sees the cameras he uses, then there is also this folkloristic glass sphere that sort of shows the whole environment. And by 1963, when we had this initial portrait, these pictures already had been used also for publications. Here already in 1951, the stairs that I showed you before, as a cover, turned around and presented as a cover of an architecture magazine. Arquitectura Mexico was the Mexican architecture magazine at the time, number 35 in 1951. And some architects, collaborators of the magazine, turned this picture into an urban landscape. So they used it as a sort of a imagined landscape with skyscrapers and public space and people walking around. And in 1961, the same image was present in an exhibition at the MoMA, curated by Bernard Rudowski, this Stairs exhibition. Here it is presented in a magazine, Interiors, Stairs, Are They Out? And this is how it looked like. So this was a presentation of various kinds of stairs. And in the middle, we have Barragán's iconic stairs of his own residence. And in 1964, one of the photographs that I showed you before makes it to the cover of another MoMA project, a publication published by MoMA, Modern Gardens and the Landscape. This was a compendium, it's a little booklet, it's not just like that, a compendium of all kinds of modern gardens all around the world. We have Roberto Burle Marx, we have Barragán, we have many others. So, this is 1963, but what happened before? I would like to go back in history and give you a bit of a background how Barragán maybe came to express his work or to find this expression for his work. Here we see Barragán aboard ship in the 1920s, probably. The photographer is unknown, also the date of the photograph, we just can assume. Let's assume that it is 1924 or 25 when he traveled to or from Europe for a more or less 1 year stay in Europe. An important trip, a seminal trip for Barragán after he finished his studies. At the same time, in 1925, in early autumn, so when Barragán returned from Europe, an exhibition took place in the Museo del Estado in Guadalajara, Barragán's hometown, institution that was affiliated to the university. It was an exhibition by photographer Edward Weston and Tina Modotti, a joint exhibition. And we don't know whether Barragán saw this exhibition or not. And also we don't know what was exhibited in this exhibition. So this is pure guessing, but still, the fact that Weston and Modotti presented their work at the time, also in Mexico City, but then in Guadalajara in this specific moment, gives us reason to think that Barragán in some or another way was aware of their work. This is a sort of a double vice versa portrait. Tina Modotti took the portrait of Weston and Weston took the portrait of Tina Modotti. Both 1924. So we have a bit of a picture of this couple, at the time, couple that moved in 1923 from California to Mexico and immediately became familiar with the local avant-garde and bohème of artists and photographers. And they soon had exhibitions and presented their work. And I'm just going to show you work that they did in this time to give the context what Barragán may have seen. Here we are not sure whether it's Edward Weston or not. It is part of Edward Weston body of works stored at the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson. I'm showing you this because it shows convent, de Pozatlan, which Barragán also liked as a place. He often went there. It's some 30 kilometers away from Mexico City. And we know from correspondence and from other narratives that Barragán liked this place very much. So this is a glimpse of Baroque colonial Mexico, somehow related to Edward Weston. But this is a photograph definitely by Edward Weston. An aqueduct in Los Remedios, taken in 1924. Clouds, also Edward Weston, 1925. A nude. One of these nudes of that series was also present in Barragán's home at a certain point. We have photographs where we see a reproduction of this work somewhere in a bookshelf. A photograph of a building in Colonia Condesa, which was a neighborhood in Mexico City that was sort of upcoming, a new neighborhood where Barragán, when he had moved to Mexico City, also built some of his first buildings. So we have an awareness for architecture, for spaces, inhabited spaces. And one photograph by Tina Modotti, stairs. And I'm showing you all this because it is important to understand what Weston and Tina Modotti, who learned from Weston, what actually was their achievement. In the beginning, photography was something that was a tool to depict reality, to show things. One could take frozen images of things and show them in another place. So the mere fact that this was possible, that was the first thrill in photography. Edward Weston, namely, but many others as well, at a certain moment contributed to sort of to turn photography into an independent art. And they had clear ideas about how about the potential of photography in an artistic manner. Especially Edward Weston, he had, like, on one hand, a very realistic approach. He used large format cameras with a very small aperture, which allows to have everything in the picture very sharp and with strong contrast. And at the same time, he also searched for abstraction, so that these images sort of became independent artworks, independent works that sort of were detached from their context, from what they were showing. So we have sort of a movement from the pictorial quality of photography to something artistic. And Edward Weston was a key figure in this movement. Now we are going back to Luis Barragán. This is a photograph of an early building by Barragán in Guadalajara. Another building which is not anymore so early, 1934, the Carmen Orozco House. This photo was taken by Roberto Salcedo Magana, sort of a multi-talent. He was a photographer, but he also did some sketches for Barragán. He also worked in his office as a draftsman, a close collaborator for a long time. The house in Calle Rayon, a small house in Guadalajara along Parque de la Revolución, also around 1934. Again, a photograph by Roberto Salcedo Magana. And a magazine of 1931, a Japanese one, Kenti Kusekai, where the work of Barragán appears in the exactly same abstract manner as we have seen. I mean, it's these photographs that appear in this magazine. And also in the architectural record in January 1935. So both we have a Japanese and we have an American magazine, which also tells that at the time already, Barragán was sort of a person to be noticed. This all, by the way, is not new knowledge. I'm just trying to give you a narrative that could serve as a framework for our talk that follows. So we see that at a very early stage, Barragán already searched for abstraction, for the abstract representation of his work, and so that it could be presented in an abstract manner, he also needed some abstraction in mind when he built it. This is my interpretation. This is another building he did when he arrived in Mexico City in 1936. At that time, he moved from Guadalajara to Mexico City, and this was one of the first, if not the first, building he did in Mexico City, photographed by Manuel Alvarez Bravo. And this is exactly in the neighborhood that we saw before, the Condesa neighborhood that Weston also photographed, this backyard. So this was just to present Barragán as someone who early had a notion for abstract photography and for the importance of photography for the promotion of his work. So with this in his in the back, at one point he has a momentous encounter. In the mid-1940s, Barragán buys land in a lava desert south of Mexico City. He buys that land with the perspective to develop it, to create an exclusive neighborhood that is built into the lava rocks with a low density and with gardens that take advantage, that use the native landscape and vegetation as a background. Prieto Lopez's house that I showed you before was built in that area. So this is an aerial view of the area during construction. In the background, you see the streets that are built. This is 1949. The project started in 45, and in 51, more or less, it started to take momentum, and Barragán stepped out of the project in 52. And in connection with this undertaking, he meets actually Armando Salas Portugal, who will be the photographer that later depicts all his seminal work, his masterpieces. Armando Salas Portugal was actually trained as he studied chemistry. He was born in Mexico, but then went to California to study chemistry, opened a perfume shop in Mexico City. He was a devoted hiker, excursionista. He went to the mountains, and he was a photographer, amateur in the best sense. He was dedicated. He was devoted to photography. He, at a certain point, also built his own cameras. And as Edward Weston, I don't know whether he was influenced or this is out of my interpretation, but similar to Edward Weston, he used these large format cameras, and he produced these pictures that are sharp in every part of the picture. And he had an incredible eye for landscape, but apparently also for architecture. So Barragán meets Salas Portugal, who was 14 years younger than Barragán. He meets the work of Salas Portugal in an exhibition in the mid-1940s, and in that moment starts this exchange. First, with the photographs that Salas Portugal takes of this virgin landscape that Barragán was about to use for his new settlement. And Barragán was totally stunned by these pictures. And he bought prints and albums. We have them all in the archive. And Barragán starts to make small interventions in the landscape. And Armando Salas Portugal is the photographer who somehow documents all these steps, but he documents them in an artistic manner. And we have this already here in the early years of their collaboration. We see that there is a sort of an exchange between the architect and the photographer. This is the entrance to Jardines de Pedregal. Barragán built some public spaces, he built some show houses, and he cut the plots, and he left the rest to the investors to come. He just created a reglamento, some rules, how the place could be built, how construction should look like. To a certain extent this worked, but already 10, 15, 20 years later, the site started to be totally overbuilt, and today you still recognize a bit, but there's not much left of the huge gardens and the volcanic landscape that is lying underneath. Still here, we have sort of this, after the virgin landscape, we have the virgin architecture photographed by Armando Salas Portugal. And Barragán also designed some fences, some definitions of plots, all in the hope to attract future investors, people who would buy his plots. And with him, Armando Salas Portugal taking these wonderful photographs that were, at the time, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, used to promote the development in magazines nationally, but sometimes also internationally. This is another view of Prieto Lopez's house. A view of Luis Barragán's roof terrace. Another view of his roof terrace. I showed you before all the works, the masterpieces photographed by Armando Salas Portugal that were produced until 1963. Now comes another one, Los Clubes, which is also early 60s, a small subdivision close to Las Arboledas, where Barragán designed this wonderful fountain, also with the idea that horses could walk through the fountain and cool down their feet. And Quadra San Cristobal, built in the late 60s, in collaboration with a younger colleague, Andrés Casillas. Actually a horse ranch with an attached private residence. And always there is Armando Salas Portugal as the one who documents, who takes the pictures and promotes Barragán's architecture for magazines and later books. And another one, actually the last collaboration between Barragán and Salas Portugal, also one of the last housing projects that Barragán did alone. This Gilardi house, built 1975 to 77. A few years later, Barragán would establish the joint partnership, the office partnership with his younger colleague Raúl Ferreira. And from that moment on, until Barragán's death in 1988, they would sign as Barragán and Ferreira architects. So Gilardi House, not the last work by Barragán, but in one way an end point to a long series of masterpieces that are known, and the end point also to the collaboration with Armando Salas Portugal. In this house we have the corridor leading to this swimming pool. Actually, beside the swimming pool we have this nice detail that the client wished to have the dining area beside the swimming pool. So you have to imagine this beautiful blue-red swimming pool with a dining table beside, so you could have nice moments. And the access to this swimming pool is through this corridor with the yellow light coming in from the side. And from here, it is not far to, for example, an installation by Dan Flavin, the Marfa project, untitled Marfa project. It is located in the marvelous setting of Marfa, the place where Donald Judd worked and invited artist friends to produce works in an old military facility. Marfa also not so far from the Mexican border in Texas. This is one example. I could give other ones, but I found this one particularly striking. I'm making the gap now from architecture to art quite consciously, in the sense that in all this I see a certain consequence, or this is a personal interpretation. When I see the photographs that Salas Portugal did of Barragán's work, it becomes clear to me that these photographs for Barragán, they were like, he used the medium of photography to produce still images of his work. There is nothing new in this. Photography is exactly this. You can produce still images. For Barragán, I guess, this was a very important step to detach his work somehow from reality. So, through the medium of photography, he could deprive his work from functional needs, but also from the context. And he had a very pure view on his own work. And in this sense, one could pretend that through the medium of photography, Barragán's work even becomes an artwork in itself. And this is a reading that I would like to suggest on the base of our long-standing working with the archive, that there is something in it that, for good reason, makes it special. Barragán's architecture, for everyone who visited it, is totally stunning. The photographs, they are stunning also in itself. They are the work of photographer Armando Salas Portugal. By the way, also many other photographers came by and took photographs of Barragán's buildings. And this is now then what we could continue in our talk, Bas, what it means to photograph Barragán after Salas Portugal. But I'm definitely convinced that for Barragán there was a deep meaning in these photographs, that he could see his work with the eyes of someone else, but the consciousness of both the photographer and the architect is for me a striking evidence that this is highly wanted and highly sort of designed, not only by the photographer, but also by the architect who produced sort of the objects for photography. So this is the furniture where the photograph collection of Luis Barragán was stored for a long time. In the meantime, they have found a new place, which is sort of more handy for an archive. But still, this is the original container. And I would like to finish this short tour with another wonderful picture, this time not by Armando Salas Portugal, but by Bert Glynn, a Magnum photographer, which for me also tells much about Barragán's universe. We have this artwork by Matthias Göritz, which is at the end just a golden surface that reflects what is around, but blurred. We have Barragán, proud. It's in 1962, so he's age 60. Self-conscious, proud, elegant, distinguished man. We have the play of light and shadow. By the way, we have also stairs, a topic that I have shown you several times in this lecture. And again, we have a noted photographer together with a noted agency that he was associated with, Magnum Photos. With this, I would like to end the first part of this evening and switch to the second part, which is our conversation about architecture and photography and the exhibition that we just opened. Thanks a lot. You did the workshop last year with students from Geneva and Mexico City. And to give a bit of to leave the Barragán space for a moment, I wanted to ask you, what was actually the reason why you became a photographer and not a designer or an architect that was one of or actually your first formation? Was there a clear moment when you decided to take that path?
Yes. When I was studying, I somehow realized that you can make space with depicting it, and that the spaces I wanted to make, I could photograph much more easily, and started in a way like that.
So you would call it a shortcut?
No, not really. I mean, it's not really a shortcut, but I think in reality, there is a lot to find, and in a way, photography can reorganize reality because it has only one perspective. And this one perspective you can use because everyone always thinks that outside of the frame, the same thing happens as inside of the frame, somehow. So you could make by photographing a detail, you could make a kind of an imaginary world that doesn't really exist. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that is how I understood it very early on. Mm-hmm. And then I think I also understood early on that architecture is a super collaborative practice, and I was more of a person who liked to do things alone.
Mm-hmm. Interesting point. Yeah. Yeah, maybe there is not much more to say. So thanks. I find this quite clear. So then let's go to this exhibition. You approached us, the Barragán Archive and Barragán Foundation and Vitra Design Museum, for an introduction to your students for a workshop that you had an idea for. Mm-hmm. So could you summarize first your initial idea, and in a second step also what you take from the workshop once it is finished and the product is lying on the table?
Well, I was asked by HEAD in Geneva, where I also teach, to lead the workshop with students from HEAD and with students from CENTRO in Mexico. They are students of architecture and interior design, so they are not students of photography. Mm-hmm. I think this is important to understand. And I imagined, of course, we know all these beautiful images of Barragán. We know the kind of abstraction. We have an immediate imagination of how the architecture would look, even if we have not seen it. But if you would approach it as an author or as someone who wants to find something of yourself, so how could you find something of yourself in Barragán? Because I think that is the most difficult part, because Barragán will always look like Barragán. That's the power of the architecture, but it's also the kind of it's also the task. So if you're not a photographer who has to photograph architecture to praise Barragan, or to praise the architecture, or to show the iconicness of it, what can you then see? And if you are an author, what can you do with another author? So that's why I imagined it to call it appropriating Barragan. So what can I take? Not in the fact take and not give, but what can I find that is of myself in this architecture? And do that through photography. Yeah. And that's then the question, and whatever is coming out is whatever we use. No?
So, but you were also participant of your workshop. Was it also an exercise for you?
Yeah, I had a secret agenda. Yeah. I had a secret agenda that I wanted to photograph the references archive of, well, reference images of Barragan that he used on this beautiful pedestal in his house. There were, I think, about 100 images that he cut out of magazines and placed on a pink board and put it to remind himself of what he somehow liked or what has a certain power as an image. So I think he was training himself to become kind of an image literate somehow.
Yes, as an aside, Barragan had lots of images, as you say, around him, and he changed them also. And he didn't care about the topic of originality, of authenticity in the sense of the original artwork. He was very much looking at the pictures. And he had people, for example, we have also in the Salas Portugal collection, we have some reproductions of books, for example, the Falling Water House by Frank Lloyd Wright. He asked Salas Portugal to take a reproduction of a book, one of these iconic photographs that are around, and to have an enlargement of that photograph, and then he put it somewhere in a shelf to have it as a reference. So he was very sort of, not careless, but he didn't care about the original, but he cared about the picture.
Yeah, and I like personally to work with images as a kind of testing ground. You know, when I did not start a project yet, I sometimes collect images. They go in a little booklet, and you somehow organize them, so pictures of other people, until there is a certain sequence that works. And I had the feeling that Barragan was doing somehow the same. He had these 100 pictures and was organizing them every day different to have ideas, okay, either colors or spaces or feeling or whatever. So I think I was interested in let's say, not how his architecture looked, but how he could imagine the image of his architecture. And I mean, it's amazing references. It's like a cover of a Grace Jones album, Grace Jones naked in a cage, then a kind of a religious cross, then a kind of a beautiful Western picture, then a kind of a badly cut out Picasso. So there was. I somehow liked that fact that the image is central without that you show the architecture, but that you show the. I mean, I did not really work yet on it a lot, but I like the fact that this process is there, so that he understood you have to become literate in images, and that images can somehow guide you further. And I think this is also strangely absent in the pictures of Portugal. It's a kind of
totally.
There's really a lot absent, and this
absolutely. It's about cutting away, definitely. Yeah. And
I mean, I would dare to say that the architecture is absent, more or less. So if you are in the buildings, the architecture is much more profound, much better organized than what you would see in the pictures. So the extreme difference between outside, which is public, outside, which is private, then inside, which is public, and inside, which is private. I think in none of these pictures you can see that or feel that, and you can only see that when you're in these buildings. So I think as an architect, he was a very good architect, but the images tell a totally different story, which is also fascinating.
Totally, I agree. And now that you did this workshop with the students, is there anything like a conclusion or something that you took from working with the students and seeing the students' works?
No, I mean, students' works is always funny because you never know what's going to come out. So I'm not a person who likes to say you have to do this or you have to do that. I prefer if you make in the end of your of course everyone takes 100, 200, 300 pictures. Okay, select one, select two that are completely not what you would expect. And then we will debate together what we can see in this picture. Mm-hmm. So the picture don't have really literally this kind of iconic quality, but it's in a way what can you find through photographing the architecture and how do you see? So what do you see? And then in the end I asked students to, well, we had a big table in Centro, really big table, like I think 2-3 times bigger as here. We had one day, the day of the opening, but we started in the morning to say, okay, now you have your pictures, and each can place one picture on the table, but you have to negotiate together. Where does it go? You are not allowed to place it in a kind of solitude alone, so it becomes an icon by itself. No, you have to understand, you have to talk to each other why a certain picture belongs in a certain corner, why your picture can be there, or sometimes they were grouping 2 pictures together, so 2 people who thought, maybe my view is becoming better together with your view. So it's always, I like when it's a conversation about what the image can do somehow, rather than what it shows.
Is there anything specific, anything like architecture photography in your eyes, or is this something that sort of fades away in favor of, let's say, I mean, if you discuss a photograph and you're maybe even discussing quality or expression or whatever, is architecture photography a theme, or is it just, are you then just discussing the photograph as a photograph?
No, architecture is a subject. And you go through it like you go through a city. Mm-hmm. So you can go through a city and be surprised about something or be reminded of something. Mm-hmm. But I think in architecture, maybe you have to be a bit. You have to have studied architecture, but then becomes fun to go through a building because you can realize that something is similar as something you saw before, and then it becomes interesting. Then you can depict it in a new way. Then you can see connections, and through photographing them you can either enhance them or you can use them in your advantage. I don't think that let's say photographing architecture as a kind of advertisement, or let's say as a kind of showing the building, is not necessarily what I'm asking them to do. No, I'm asking them, what can you find? You know, if you would walk in the street, you would photograph something. Take the same mentality, go to a building and look in that way. What can you find? What can you see? Do you see new things? Do you see similar things? Can you make the building look like something else? I think there were a few photographs in there that are also kind of funny observations. I think there is one, I don't know who made it now. There's this little square window in the kitchen of a house that is the only window in the house of Barragán that looks to the street. But literally the only window, and it's in the servant's kitchen. So as an owner, you would not come there. So that's the picture that is taken. So that's the picture that, in a way, where the architecture is dissolved, which I somehow also like. But still it's there.
I mean, what for us is very refreshing to have these pictures there is exactly this aspect that the photographs that we have, we do not only have Salas Portugal pictures, but they make a large portion of Luis Barragán's archive. They hardly never show the architecture in use. Also, it was another time. The pictures were produced when the buildings were fresh, or
still relatively fresh.
But
sometimes Salas Portugal came back, sometimes later.
But if you look, there is almost no living space, there is definitely no kitchen, there is no sleeping, so private space is not there at all. So it's also interesting, this kind of a choice to have only semi-public, public spaces.
Again, we are very glad to have this sort of counterbalance, or this counterweight to our historic view on Barragán, which is given by the fact that we work with the archive. This is a very valuable sort of change of perspective, and we're very glad to have this.
Well,
so also thank you for the audience.
Thank you
for your visit.